This podcast is brought to you by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. By the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And by Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. We are excited to welcome back Dr. Randy Woodley. Randy's work addresses a variety of issues concerning American culture, faith, justice, race, our relationship with the earth, and Indigenous realities. He currently serves as Distinguished Professor of Faith and Culture at Portland Seminary, Portland, Oregon. His expertise has been sought in national venues as diverse as Time Magazine, Christianity Today, the Huffington Post, and Planet Drum, a voice for bioregional, sustainability, education, and culture. His new book is titled Mission and the Cultural Other. Randy Woodley joins us today on the Vickers Crossing.
All right.
Oh.
Ooh, baby. Ooh, baby.
Got it. Okay, here we go. Here you go in 3, 2, and 1. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you may be and wherever you may be listening. We welcome you back to another edition of the Vickers Crossing podcast, a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. Glad to have you back with us. And if it's your first time tuning into the podcast, a big welcome to you. Yeah. My name is Rob Henderson, and I am one of the two vicars here on the Vickers Crossing, and I serve as the parish priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London, Ontario.
Yes, Rob, good to be together again. My name is Kevin George. I am a priest in the Anglican Church, and I'm in the Diocese of Huron at St. Aidan's Anglican Church in the northwest corner of the city.
Very good. Very good. You did good, young man.
K is for Kevin. Kind and serene.
That's right. We're continuing on with our seventh season here at the Vickers Crossing, and today we're excited to welcome back a friend to the podcast. It's always nice to have folks come back. That means, I guess, we did something okay the first time.
Right? Yeah.
Dr. Randy Woodley is going to be joining us today.
Awesome.
And Randy is a public intellectual, author, activist, a farmer, scholar, speaker, and wisdom keeper.
Yep.
He is a recognized leader in the fields of Indigenous and intercultural studies, ecology, spirituality, race, theology, and mythology. And Randy is a Cherokee descendant, recognized by the Katua Band. And Randy has released a couple of books this year, and today we're going to be chatting about his piece of work, which is titled Mission and the Cultural Other, a Closer Look.
Yes. Awesome. As we take up that conversation, which really does sort of focus on Western European theology or Christianity and colonization, really, this book really sort of addresses the need for us to come to grips with cultural and regular genocide of peoples. So we begin by acknowledging that the land upon which we record this podcast are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Anindilysh peoples, on lands that are connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. When these lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples with whom we wish to work together towards reconciliation. We've much to do to listen some more and unlearn some more, and then see if we can learn right ways of being in relationship. So we offer that.
Randy's work is crucial to that.
Absolutely.
In many ways. So we want to commend you to read a lot of what he has offered, including the book we're going to talk about. And we do this every time we get together with a big help from our wonderful sponsors on the Vickers Crossing. First, a big thank you to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And our thanks again to Dave Mullen and the staff at A. Miller George today.
Thank you, Dave. And of course, we offer our thanks to the folks at the Diocese of Huron. The Diocese of Huron is a new sponsor with us this year, offering our thanks to Bishop Todd Townsend. The Diocese of Huron is a community of faith all the way from Windsor to Owen Sound, and from Kitchener down to Waterloo and London and all points in between. A bunch of people who are, God help us, working to become closer to a revelation of what the reign of God might look like.
And as much as we try, Kevin and I try to keep this podcast clean, but we all need help once in a while.
Yes.
And that's why we're thrilled to have our friends Molly Maid back with us for another season. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And we thank Tricia Listar for being a big part of our podcast, and for Molly Maid for supporting us. So thank you.
Yeah, hard to keep this clean when I'm around.
It's difficult. Thank God we got Ian to edit. That's all.
Well, I should say on this, you wouldn't expect this, but I have another podcast I take part in with my brother Daryl. It's called Guambai Podcast. It's a little hobby we have about Newfoundland trivia. Yeah. Interestingly enough, he's the teacher and I'm the preacher, and our little tagline is "Where the teacher schools the preacher." And we don't do a lot of editing in this podcast. It's pretty much what we do when we record. There's usually very little tidying up. But with my brother's podcast, I have all kinds of stuff to do. And it's not because of him, ironically. It's because of
the preacher.
It's because of the preacher. Daryl is constantly saying to me, okay, you got to edit that out. You got to edit that out. I'm on such a tight leash with this guy. It's unbelievable. So I'm just thankful to you that you let me be my offensive self.
Oh, not a problem.
But I always say that this other podcast I got, it's like I'm the Don Cherry to his Ron McLean. Like he's constantly going, "Oh no, you can't say that. That's offensive." I'm like, I don't understand.
Well, it's anyway. A lot of fun, and not being from there myself, I learn a lot. But I laugh a lot too, so it's a good thing you guys got going.
Funny
there.
Crew, funny crew.
Good for you.
Anyway,
all right. I think Randy's knocking on the door, wants to get in here. So why don't we let him in?
We should let Randy in there. He can perhaps try and clean me up too. We'll see what happens there.
And we're back, and Randy joining us once again here on the Vickers Crossing podcast. Randy, welcome back. Good to have you back for a second run through here in the Vickers Crossing. How have you been keeping?
I've been doing pretty good, had my ups and downs like all of us.
Yeah, definitely. Good. Well, we hope you're healthy and the family's well. And we're looking forward to talking today about the book, Mission and the Cultural Other, a closer look. So we'll be getting into that in our time together today.
Well, but before we do, I think you should tell people, Randy, what you just told us, which is that, this business about writing.
So I said, we were just talking, and I said, this might be the last book I ever write. Not sure at this point. It feels like it. And the reason why is because I decided to start writing movies. So I've just finished my first screenplay, and I'm hoping to shop it and get it made into a movie. And I just love the process. It was so much more fun than writing books.
That is awesome. Although I will have to say that the way you've been churning out these books, I'll miss being able to pick them up and read them. But you've given us a lot. With that in mind, we're talking about this book, Mission and the Cultural Other, a closer look. This book is so great, Randy, for many great reasons. But I think one of the primary reasons is your unique perspective. And you describe yourself in the book as a missionary and an anti-missionary. You rightly described the current approaches to North American mission as fraught with dangers, as they are not based in Native American values or within the framework of what you've described previously and in this book as the Harmony Way. I wonder if you can say something at the outset about what living in juxtaposition with Christianity and Indigenous spirituality, particularly as it relates to the Western world being in dire need of being saved from itself, as you put it, being healed through America's and the world's host peoples, our own need for healing.
That's quite a question, Kevin.
Yeah, I know.
Let's see how I can get into that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so our Native American values, which reflect our spirituality, are, I would say, very, very similar by and large to what Jesus taught and what he valued. And so in that way, I would say, because the West has been captured by a particular worldview that alienates them from themselves and the world and each other, instead of being related to everything else in a reciprocal relationships, that the West has bought into a system of values based on their spirituality, which tends to be mostly beliefs, that is antithetical to what Jesus taught. And so, in other words, the sort of the first problem that some of the early settlers faced when they got here was that they found not a perfect people by any means, right? There was all kinds of things going on that were, or every society has their own sorts of things, but a people who were actually much closer to living out what Jesus was saying than themselves. And they had never heard the word Jesus before, and yet the settler folk were claiming to be followers of Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that what struck me about reading it was just that sort of reality that I think, again, we get, and I'm saying we here as a part of this bland white group here, but the Western Christianity, we continue to fall back on these positions that, and you outline this throughout the book, that's the default position, right? As if there's nothing for us to learn or to come to know. And so we we have, as Western Christianity, cheated ourselves of healing that we need.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there was just so much hubris in the beginning, right?
Yeah.
They came over, folks who came over from England, for example, under King James, already assumed that the land was theirs by right.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And so everyone else who was on the land actually invaders.
Yeah.
Which is, the total opposite reality. But that just goes to show what a sort of a society based on thousands of years of Greek dualism and classical Greek philosophical thinking change reality into an unreality. And that's exactly, I'm saying that's exactly what Western Christianity has done throughout its missional conquest, is to turn that what is real into their own made up sort of ideas that they have everything to teach and nothing to.
And that's been to our detriment. And you write about in the book about Christianity here in North America, and that it's missing something, right? You speak of a church that is led, that by and large has lost its moral influence in society, a church that is in rapid decline. I mean, we see this all around us. It's clear that people are saying no to the two hallmarks, saying no to the hallmarks of American society, and are also saying no to Western Christianity. You also point out that those who are departing from familiar spiritual franchises are not necessarily leaving the Christian faith, but leaving a system that no longer seems to value them, their spiritual needs or their emotional needs. And I'll just read this small quote from the book. You write, "Most dissatisfied people just want a government that responds to the voices and concerns of the people. Disenfranchised citizens just want to stop corporate subsidies, graft, corruption. Most dissatisfied Christians don't want to get rid of meeting altogether. Disenfranchised followers of Christ just want to stop the hypocrisy and allow power to be used for the good of everyone. The parallel to the church and society is that overall people want a more just society and more responsive systems." Can you say more about how the churches, like other institutions, begin to be replaced because people in them have felt helpless or voiceless?
Yeah. So, there tends to be in any sort of structure, tends to move toward what we call homeostasis, right? That means that it's sort of like everything stays the same, right? And then in the West, they shroud that with things like rules and doctrines and all of those kinds of things, and that basically values a sort of and it's often homogeneous, that system over the actual people itself.
Yeah.
And so we have a couple generations now, the millennials and Gen Zs in particular, who are not buying into that paradigm whatsoever, and they're leaving the church and other institutions in droves. I mean, my classes, I would say probably at least 50%. Some I've asked my students, and they'll say 75%.
Yeah.
For existential reasons. This is a seminary, right?
Right. Yeah.
Basically the questions they're asking is like, how do I hold on to Jesus and get out of this hypocritical structure that I found myself in for so long? Mm-hmm. And I mean, everywhere I'm running into people who's, does anybody go to church anymore? I mean, in most places I go, it's assumed that no, I don't go anymore. Yeah. And it's because it's an unresponsive system. Not at all what Jesus taught. Not at all.
Right. Yeah. There's a prayer, or we call it like a doxology, that we do at the end of all of our worship services every week. And at the beginning of it says, "Glory to God who can do much more than we could ever ask or imagine." And, we say that every week, but whether or not we actually believe that is another thing. But you make clear that God is much greater than what Western Christianity has imagined. And there's a quote in the book I wanted to read for folks, because you're talking about this idea of thinking about what if. And you're right that as a student of history, I tend to think in terms of what if. Like, what if white people had come to this country with an open view of learning from Native Americans? What if the Westerners had viewed Indigenous peoples as equals? What if the foreign missionary project to the cultural other was based on respect and equality and equity instead of genocide, land theft, and creating sub-level categories of human beings? We may never know the full answers to these questions, but knowing both cultures well, you say, I can easily surmise that the outcomes for America's Indigenous people would have been much brighter. In fact, in terms of respect for Christianity, it could not be much dimmer. And one of the ways you frame that is by talking about, past mission efforts having not spoken to the hearts of Native Americans, as you mentioned. European churches speak to the mind, putting priority on doctrine and subjugation. So can you say a bit more about, what you are seeing today among Native Americans who have, found it more important to follow Jesus than actual European Christianity? Because there's a big difference there.
Yeah. And it's a struggle. I mean, and people are in all kinds of places. So back in the mid 90s, I was part, as a number of others were, myself and my wife, Richard Twiss, Jerry LeBlanc, Casey Church, Robert Francis, and Fern Cloud, a number of people across the country who were trying to figure this thing out. Like how can we're not liking the Western church, right? Mm-hmm. But how can we follow Jesus, who we've all had, experiences with, that, can never be talked out of our faith, right? But how can we do this as Native people and not be total hypocrites, right? And so at the time, 98% of, probably more like 99% of all the models out there were what I call of Native churches were a poor imitation of a bad model. Yeah, they were, sort of a sad imitation of a white church. With including the Scandinavian Jesus on the wall and nothing native in the church, because that was all considered evil, right? Or at least the flesh. Yeah. And so we began we picked up again, because the high church basically, some of the more high church movements back in the 80s were sort of doing this. There's a book written called Around the Sacred Fire that kind of documents some of that. And then we were all sort of in our evangelicals, right, at the time. in mid 90s. And so we began to, I say mid 90s, we found each other. It was actually the late 80s when a lot of us started this. I started this journey in 89, basically trying to, my sort of phrase at the time was the Jesus road can be walked in moccasins.
Yes. Yes.
And so, I thought, and we all thought we were the only ones doing this, right? And then we began to meet each other in the mid 90s. And then it became what was called they were calling the Native American Cultural Contextual Movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the missiologists loved it, and they were like, "You guys are cultural contextualists," and we didn't know any better words for that.
Yeah.
So we were like, "Oh, okay, that's what we're doing is cultural contextualization." But after some of us we're working on it was actually in the midst of working on our dissertations for our doctorates. We began to, like Richard and I had a lot of conversations, Richard Twist, with, is this what we're really doing? I mean, or are we saying like cultural contextualization comes out of the, Fuller School and stuff?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. That's not quite really what we're doing. What we're actually doing is saying that like our native stuff doesn't have to be redeemed.
Right.
God already blessed it,
Yeah.
He blessed it for thousands and thousands and thousands of years with our native ancestors. And by and large, what they were doing was good stuff. And now the dilemma right now is that we have people in all kinds of places. So my wife and I, we just like say, well, we're just Native people doing what Native people do. We don't put any spin on it, call it any kind of names or anything. It's just like we practice our Native traditions and we love Jesus. But other people are like, well, let's take these sort of native based things like our songs and formula, and then let's add Jesus to everything, right?
Yeah.
So they call that cultural contextualization, and to me that sort of speaks badly about Creator's relationship with our ancestors.
Right.
It says, well, it wasn't really complete until now. That's not what we believe.
Right.
And so, and then there are other people who do, various things, and now they look like sort of a native-y version of a hip church,
Right.
And so I'm not sure how to describe Native America right now in terms of finding Jesus. I think we're probably as messed up and confused as everybody right now. But, we have, so our fellowship is built around a sweat lodge. Yeah. And people come from all over, and we sweat and we talk and we eat together and we laugh and we pray and we sing and we do it in our native way. And then, if there's trouble in the community, they gather some elders together who are not elected elders, or just seen as elders, and they say, hey, can you help us with this problem? And so in essence, we're functioning like a church, but we're a community, right?
Right. That's right.
We're a native community, and everybody in this is not a Christian.
Right.
Everybody in this is not calling on Jesus or calling themselves a follower of Jesus. But and so I think there's like more of that to come.
Yes.
Right.
And we'll see where it goes.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things in church that Kevin and I talk about a lot, is this idea that, to the detriment of church, we've spent more time worrying about how we function than we do about how we are as a community. Like,
there you go.
Bass backwards, right?
And
that can really, take a chunk out of you.
So
I didn't know you could say, I didn't know you could infer the word ass on this program.
Yes, listen, definitely.
The very fact that I'm here is affirmation of asshood.
Yeah.
Asshood is perfect.
That was an easy one.
Yeah.
Okay, demonstration, right?
And our bishop doesn't listen, so we're okay.
And when he does, he doesn't expect much from me.
Right.
I was going to say, I was going to make a quote. I have my friend who's Canadian, Ray Ald.
Yes.
And he used to say, watching this kind of stuff, and he'd say, they tape a feather on their arse and jump around, and they call that contextualization.
That's very good.
That's perfect.
That is a very good quote.
Perfect. Yeah,
So,
I like
and it kisses up very close to cultural appropriation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I mean, you know,
and that was one of the differences between right away between sort of myself and my wife, Robert Francis, Fern Cloud. So some of the people who I would like, they would look at us and maybe call us purist or something like that. But what we would say is like, protocol is the most important thing of all this. You can't just do these things. You have to have someone to help you. You have to have permissions, et cetera, and do them in a right way so that traditional people respect you. And some of that started coming along with some people much later. Some people still haven't got there. And for us, it's always been do things in the right way. That's the way we've always done things.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Canada, so I wanted to ask you about something that took place in Nova Scotia. We know you've traveled, tens of thousands of miles across Turtle Island, visiting First Nations and Indigenous peoples, and you write about your experience in speaking to a group of academics in Wolfville, Nova Scotia. And I'm wondering if you could share a bit of that story here, because I think it speaks to this issue of Jesus being limited to what councils and magisteriums have determined, which is juxtaposed over and against the harmony way, which you speak strongly about.
Yeah. So, like I could talk all day about how much I love lobster and how many I got. Is that the part you wanted me to talk about?
No, I think we were specifically thinking about that story that you told to those academics about why, you shared the story yourself of the elders.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I began, I was, and the folks at Wolfville were really great. They were kind. Native guy, Danny Zacharias, was sort of my host while I was up there, and I had a great time. And of course that book, the book before this one, Indigenous Theology in the Western Worldview, came out of that, those talks. But it was a challenge because, and I didn't even know the Hayward lectures were a big deal, right?
Yeah.
So I got invited, and then someone said, "You got invited to the Hayward lectures? Oh my God. You know who's spoken there? N.T. Wright and F. Bruce and and I'm like, well, why on earth did they invite me?
Because they wanted to get it right for a change.
Oh, okay. So I went, and it's a little bit hoity-toity, or at least people sort of look at it that way. And I tried to make it in an Indigenous format as much as possible. So in order to do that, you not only have to tell stories, and of course we were welcomed by the local people there and everything, and that was wonderful. We were greeted and spent good time with them. But it was a sort of thing where you have to create disequilibrium in order for people to hear you. Yeah. Now, I don't know if my understanding is based on my training in anthropology, whereas like when you move from one life sort of change to another, there's usually a season of liminality, right? So you lose something, you create a liminality even for a ceremony or whatever. And then you sort of more open to change. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance, right? It's it's not being able to reconcile your old place with something new coming forward. And so I told this story that I knew would throw them off, and it was about this on the Lakudere reservation with the elder and time I'd spent, and basically the story is about how a traditional person knew all about Jesus, who had never been exposed to priest or boarding school or the Bible or anything else, and had this relationship, right? And so I think that kind of started things off well. They were like, huh? And then maybe, the idea was they might be able to hear what I had to say. So,
yeah. And I found that business of that story itself really quite profound, because, this person who's relating this to you as you're sharing it is telling the story of Jesus, and not having had any sort of westernized idea of who Jesus was from the Western perspective.
Yeah. And the guy telling the story, the elder, was talking about his uncle who was telling him Don't criticize Jesus because he's a great spirit. And we were just asking for permission to speak up there and be, to speak about spiritual things. We were asking for permission, which we do wherever we go, basically, wherever there's an intact community, to ask for permission. And we've had a lot of good encounters, but anytime we've ever done that, what we've never experienced is the elder saying, what are you talking about? There's a right way to do these things, and generally you're respected if you do them the right way.
Yeah. Listen, the main cut and thrust of Western civilization, you point out, was to make the Indian disappear, right? I mean, we've been talking about this a lot here in Canada with the reckoning that's happening with the unearthing of graves and so on. We've seen it in really the most violent and treacherous of ways with residential schooling. The invisible goal, of course, is, I mean, there's no other way to sum it up, but white supremacy. And you make the case that the Western missionary experience was to create white space, to protect that space, and to protect that space at all cost. And I think that's part of what we see playing out now with some of the hard right and the way they're responding to things. I mean, it's like, it's this obsession with keeping everything that they believe is somehow divinely theirs. So you got the doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny, residential boarding schools, along with oppressive bureaucracies, had been educating Christian denominations well into the present era, and that has shaped all of us. And that, I think, it makes a big difference. You write that and you touched on this earlier, for Gen Xers, millennials, and Gen Zs, they're asking for a new paradigm, right? Something other than the one handed down to them by their parents and grandparents. They're examining old ethnocentric epistemologies, and they're hoping to create a new paradigm that will form their spiritualities, and for those who remain in the church, their missional concerns. Unfortunately, you write, like the old adage goes, the previous generations are cutting off their nose to spite their face, and those new ways of thinking are being met with resistance. And as I said, we're seeing that now in the hardest core of the right wing, and sort of what Robert P. Jones writes about in terms of white nationalist Christianity, right? It's this sort of oppressive things. Yeah. So you got young people looking for something that goes beyond these sort of epithets and stereotypes. I wonder if you can say more about all of that, and perhaps a word to the listener who might not have heard yet the words manifest destiny or the doctrine of discovery.
Well, there's a through line, right? That actually goes. I actually start this through line in the book before this one, in ancient Greece with Socrates and Plato, and through Alexander the Great and Aristotle and his student Alexander the Great, and then the Renaissance, and then the Reformation and the Enlightenment, and to the shores of America. And so and part of the manifestations of that through line are things like the doctrine of discovery, which the Catholic Church created, several times. So there were several papal bulls. One was during the Crusades, a couple hundred years earlier. The next one was Intiquatara, which was in 1493. Interesting, based on what Columbus, thought he discovered in 1492.
That's right. Yeah.
God would say, okay, now any undiscovered land now belongs to Christians and kings, and the Catholics made this. The Roman Catholics made this rule called the doctrine of discovery. Is what we call it. But the Protestants were very happy to go along with it. The only thing at the
Church of England, the Church of England lapped it up like milk.
Yeah. So it became basically a Christian doctrine. And then that was that sense of like, we own the land. This is ours, right? We planted a flag on it. You people aren't Christians, and so we now therefore own it. And in fact, you are indebted to us, and the best thing you could do is convert, and we'll make you slaves. And the worst thing you can do is not convert, and we'll kill you.
That's right.
And that was the storyline as it went through. And then in later on the frontiers of the Americas here, we had this manifest destiny idea that it was our manifest destiny the manifest destiny of white people in the West to conquer natives and continue to expand in the name of Jesus, right? Even though they weren't missionaries necessarily, but missionaries always basically accompanied these forward movements, right? So there was always this cooperation, or almost always, between the missionary folk and the military folk of the government, right?
Yeah.
And then now we see it here in the United States. We see it with something called American exceptionalism. So you cannot be elected a president in this country unless you say that they believe in American exceptionalism, that America is sort of the God-given best country on earth. You have to say that to be elected president. I've never seen one elected that didn't say that.
Yes, shocking. And those generations that you mentioned are like I see I mean, even in this midterm election, right? Like the talk is that the younger people who voted ended up making a difference over what the pollsters were predicting. And I think a lot of that comes from this rejection of this sort of, these manifestations of grandiosity and supremacy.
Yeah, apparently folks have had enough of, this Trumpism and, the silliness of all of that. And hopefully in Canada, they've had enough of it too. I don't know.
Well, my worry is we're having a delayed reaction here. Trumpism is just catching up. But anyway, listen, you write about the other thing, picking up on that theme of the doctrine of discovery specifically. You write about missionaries being the heroes of, or the protected class of the church, especially with respect to how that relates to American cultural genocide. By way of example, you published in full in the book an open letter that you wrote to Pope Francis that was published in the Huffington Post. And this was in a response to the bestowing of sainthood upon Junipero Serra. The letter was, incredibly direct, Randy. I love the letter. I was like, I can get behind this letter. I wonder if you can share the gist of that with our listeners and a little bit about Sarah, because people here in Canada may not know that history so well. And the spirit of your letter, particularly as it relates to what the Pope said about the sins of the past when he was speaking to Congress, I think it was, or whatever. And he's, I just wonder if you can give people a sense of that. Like I say, first, who is this Junipero Serra, and why writing to the Pope was so important?
Yeah, difficult name to say fast.
Yeah.
But so he was basically in charge of missions in Northern and Middle California. And on behalf of the Catholic Church, and this would have been sometime, I can't remember the exact dates, but I think in the 1500s. And so basically the idea, he enslaved the native people. And they all had to, they were all forced to work for the Spanish government there, and he gave permission for the men to rape the women, for his guards to rape the women whenever they wanted. He had a policy of if a person ran away and then when they were brought back, he would cut off half of their foot. So like, the half in the middle of your foot that would include your toes and everything else, sort of as a sign, and teach them not to run away. Which incidentally, there was a statue of him unveiled. I can't remember if it was Santa Barbara or where it was exactly, in California. And they had protested. The Latino community and the Native community both were protesting putting this statue up of Junipero Serra. And so they went through with it, but when they unveiled it, it was missing half a foot. And I thought, boy, that's Indian humor. I know
some good subversive stuff right there.
Right back at you.
So and so he was sainted. He was canonized by the Pope, which I could
very recently, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, this was, I don't know,
5-6 years ago.
Yeah. And everybody loved Pope Francis. And I'm like, why are you, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And so I wrote a letter objecting to this, and never did get a response, of course. But I think, for me, what topped it all off was that when the Pope addressed Congress,
Yeah.
That's our governmental body here.
Yeah.
And he said that something to the effect of, we know that things were done wrong in the past. He didn't mention specifically natives or anyone else, but things were done wrong in the past. But we have to remember that they were people of their time. And so then they got a standing ovation. He got a standing ovation. It's like, oh boy, all sins are forgiven from the past. Don't worry about it anymore, And my response to that, because I hear that all the time talking to people, there were people of their time, and I'm like, well, what about those people of their time who also were there at the same places, who stood against all of this oppression? Right. The ones who sacrificed sometimes their lives and their families to fight against it. Yeah. The scriptures say, honor those, who work among you, give the honor to whom honor is due. Yeah. Honor is due those people, but not the people who went with quote unquote conventional wisdom, including racism and genocide and everything else. They were dishonorable. And I think it reflects poorly on the ones who did sacrifice. Those are the heroes. Mm-hmm. When we say, oh, they were just people of their time.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that, because that's helpful, because I hear that a lot too, especially when we're talking about residential schools, and well, it was just the way it was. Like, there's nothing you could have done about it back then, and so on and so forth. And you hear that a lot too in this context.
And yet there were people in the day who were standing up against that.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
Well, in my work, I've studied a lot of missionaries because of my readings and everything else. And in just about every era, there were always people standing against those atrocious things that were happening. Yeah. And those are the people we need to, build up and honor. And we need to, speak the truth about the ones who weren't.
Exactly. Yeah. So I want to get into the second half of the book a little bit. You talk in the second half of the book about new missional foundations, the demographic realities that we're facing, and the challenges with whiteness theologies. And you write about questions of authority and about human spirituality without religion. But you also write about reframing some of the old constructs. And I wonder if we could talk about a couple of those, like reframing salvation as healing that you write about. Reframing kingdom as community. And there are others in this chapter, of course, but I wonder, Randy, can you give our listeners maybe a little taste of this reframing by speaking about maybe these two constructs, salvation to healing and kingdom to community?
Yeah, so I'll deal with the second one first. Sure. Jesus talked about, basilion ton theon, right? Mm-hmm. Which was translated by King James translators as kingdom of God. Mm-hmm. But the word kingdom is not there. It's basically just, it means a place where God is in charge, right? And so it was translated at the time kingdom because, King James was a king, and, that was common to their understanding. I've never, known any sorts of authority of a king or queen for that matter. Yeah. So I don't relate to that at all. So I think what Jesus was saying was like, there's this new world, new reality, new realm, if you will, where God can be in charge. And to me, that I think today he would use the phrase community of creation. Yeah. It's like everything. It's especially in this age of globalization and this age of us understanding how the reciprocal relationship we have with nature and everything else. So I think it would include everything. And Jesus would be talking about the community of creation. Now, another phrase that I say would, if you're going to use kingdom, you use shalom kingdom. Yeah. Or if you even want, you could say shalom empire. Right. Right. Because he's trying to juxtapose what it means to live under God's rule and reign and God's grace and benefits, and living in a way of shalom, as opposed to living in the way that the philosophy of this world based on greed and competition, all those things have taught us to live. The other, probably most important thing I would say is this whole idea of salvation. Yeah. that's I think an antiquated word. I think it's a word that has so much baggage that when we talk about being saved and being lost and being, so and it's sort of like this idea of like one conversion to truth, as if there's only one conversion to truth, and then we got it. So I think an alternative word that is also very valid is the word healing. And so when we think of like where Paul says it's translated, now is our salvation much closer than when we first began. It makes more sense to say, like, we think, well, what does that mean? It makes more sense to say, now is our healing much closer than when we first began, because we are being healed, and we will be healed. It will continue along these lines of healing. And so I think that's a word that's much more accurate and theologically constructive than salvation.
Well, for me, it always speaks to the now of it too, as far as salvation is not. When we speak of salvation, like you say, there's so much baggage, and I hear mostly it's about something's going to happen later.
Right.
Healing is about being healed now. Like I'm in pain now. I don't need to be healed 6 months from now.
And now. And being healed on an ongoing basis.
And an ongoing basis. Yeah.
And as far as speaking of that kingdom business, I thought as I was reading this is perfect timing, because of course Sunday in the Revised Common Lectionary is what people like the so-called Feast of Christ the King, or as some of our churches now are wont to phrase it, the Reign of God, or the Reign of Christ, the Feast of the Reign of Christ, precisely because of this sort of conversation, because the baggage and we're preaching in a country that has a king previously, a queen, but still most of our people, I would say, have no real affinity for that in terms of talking about their own faith journey. I don't think that's how they relate to their God, is as a supreme ruler, like
and a king or a queen. That's the idea that tells me what to do, and I don't think that's who God is. Our Creator, ask us to journey with God.
And the other part I love about what you write about that is about how the connection with all of creation, and it's that, it's not just about us, our anthropocentric sort of nature, right? Like we're just so focused on humanity and
being humans
saved
above nature rather than being part of nature.
Crazy. That's so much we could go on all day, but what I want to ask you about to conclude, I guess, is that question that people will say to you: how do we fix this, Randy? You write about this in the book. Can you fix it for us, Randy? Let me put that on you, because
no, that's not what they usually say. If they're white, they usually say, "Oh, I have an idea how I can fix this."
Oh, wow, that's even
exactly.
So you write in the book about how often you get that sort of question from well-intended white dudes like us, and you say, I'm used to the question, so I don't get offended by it, but it's loaded with bad assumptions, you point out. It assumes that the problem can be fixed. It assumes that the same white savior complex that has driven missions up to this point, that if given the chance, we can fix it. The question assumes that the cultural other is not powerful enough to fix their own problems, and it assumes that white folks are still in power. And maybe it assumes that it can be fixed without deep sacrifice. You go on to write about how the assumptions that are held in that question, how to fix it, or how do we fix it, can speak to us about the assumptions that oppressors understand the problem, which clearly so many of us don't, or that they can even relate to it, which so many of us can't. So you write about the need to listen and listen and listen some more, and then and keep listening until that question is reframed. And so I wonder if you can say a word to our listeners about what that reframing looks like and what that follow-up question could be, instead of how do we fix it?
I think you're kind of asking me how you fix it.
I think I'm not trying to ask you.
I'm not trying to.
Let me respond to that. Okay. As I was writing the book, right, I was running for Liffenstock, and they had been after me for a long time to do this book, and I finally did it. And I love my editor, great guy. And I got about halfway through, because this is sort of my magnum opus, right? I'm a missiologist. I've been teaching mission for all these years, and I'm halfway through, and he says, "Well, let me read what you got so far." And I sent it to him, and because I had a whole nother half of a book that I hadn't written yet.
Yeah.
And I knew what I was going to write. And it was sort of like the answer to this question in a way. And he says, well, this is a book here. He said, let's just publish this as a book. Let's, change a few things around and publish this. This will be book one. And then we'll do another one called Mission and Community Context or something like that. And that'll be book two. And so I told him, I said, well, okay, let's go ahead and publish this one, but I want to see how you guys do with advertising this and getting it out and marketing and everything. And before I commit to doing the second half of this or the second book. And they actually did a very poor job. And so I'm not happy with them. So I've not written that, and I may never write it, or maybe if somebody else wants me to write it, I'll write it for them if it's worthwhile. But so that's sort of what happened. The whole second half of the book was supposed to be about, like, here's the kinds of things we do. And I specifically in this book was saying, this is not a how to fix it book.
Right.
This is like drawing your attention to the problem. Mm-hmm. And I think we often in the West jump so fast, and it's sort of it's sort of an American trait too, is to say, like, oh, we can fix anything. Hey, climate change, no problem. Yeah, let's just let it go on till almost the end. And we'll figure out a way.
Overnight. We can do it overnight.
Yeah. It's like driving with the engine light on. That's what I don't worry about it for now.
Yeah. So that, like, how do you reframe this stuff in a way that people can actually talk to one another about it? Mm-hmm. Where Native folks and non-Native folks can sit down and talk at the table together, and in a way that non-Native people won't get up and leave.
Right.
Because they don't have to be at the table. What will even draw them to the table to discuss it? This is the sort of genius of the leadership right now. So what we need, people who can say, all right, it is to our benefit to be at that table. Right. And we can't, once we commit to being there, we can't get up and leave. We can't leave no matter how many truths and ugly truths and dead bodies and anger and tears and, everything else, no matter how many sad stories we hear, we have to be able to talk about this. And I know that was the aim of, TRC.
Right.
But, you guys have experienced that now. That there's more work to be done, right?
Lots.
And this is the work. This is the work, is to sit down and to say, I'm committed to this process. And it means a lot of listening. Yeah. A lot of listening. And so I've been proposing, and I don't know anybody with the funding to do this, but what I've been proposing is that we have a North American listening tour.
Yeah.
Where for 2 years, we just go across all of North America and we listen to elders and others share their stories. And we get white folks to be there, settler people to be there and hear those stories. And then after 2 years, we decide where to go from there. Yeah. Because, and there's talk here now about people want a Truth and Reconciliation Committee or a Truth and Reconciliation Commission here. Yeah. And I'm like, no, we want a Truth Commission. Yes. That's what we want. We want to hear the truth. If you say truth and reconciliation, there's already the assumption, like, here's what we're going to do afterwards. Yeah. And that doesn't respect the process.
I think that's what I hear in the frustration in people today, is I think that inherent in what was said to us a decade ago or more now, when they said we're going to have truth and reconciliation in this country, it already set us up for the notion that, okay, well, here's what's going to happen. The commission's going to do its work. We're going to have these recommendations. Interested parties will, by nature of being compelled, will do the best they can to fulfill those. And then it's reconciled. And of course, it's not, because for the people who've told these stories and the listening that was done, the stories, they're not done telling their stories, and we're not done listening, and that's why, like what I was trying to get to, in that last bit of the book, you say that question can best be changed into, besides listening and continuing to listen, right? Please let me know when you think there's anything you want me to do, right? That's a different question than how do I fix it, right?
And it takes away that white savior mentality, right? It's that and there are things. I mean, there's like I'm gonna make some generalizations that are gonna get you guys in trouble right now, but
we don't care.
in general, white people know how to make money, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we have not had the experience and the networks to do that. So what we know how to do is survive.
Yeah.
Like we can survive without a lot of money and everything else. But in order for our voice to be amplified, we need more money. Right.
Right.
And so someone could say, well, I'm good at that. Let me ask them if they would like, my help with that.
Mm-hmm.
That's not taking away agency. That's not saying the white savior. We're just saying I have some gifts here, and if you need them and would like to use them, let's do that. So that's just one example, right?
Yeah. Well, let me know when that tour starts, will you?
Because, let me know. I'm leave it up to you guys.
Yeah, and I just, like I said, there's so much in this book, and I couldn't commend it to people's reading enough. And it's like all your books, Randy. I mean, I picked them up and I can't put them down, and I feel conflicted and convicted and hopeful, and at the same time, I feel like there's work to do, and I just, and that's, I've always put down your book feeling that way, and I think that's where, for me, as a priest in the church, as a descendant of white settlers, I think I need to be provoked to be convicted and to think about how we can get more opportunities for listening and conversation, because I have so much to unlearn, that your wisdom is appreciated.
I appreciate you saying that. Thank you. I maybe about 10 years ago, I started getting this particular compliment every now and then, and I really took it to heart, and I love it. And people would say, you say some really hard things, but I can tell it's just full of love.
That's right.
And that's the goal. That's my personal goal, is to be able to say, I can speak truth and I can speak it in love.
Yeah. Well, you do it very well.
Yeah, we're appreciative here on the podcast, and I know our listeners are today, and we know a lot of people tuning into this right now are scratching their heads a little bit, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing.
Right.
To work toward that. Yeah.
I'm
Mission and
forward.
the Cultural Other: A Closer Look is the book. And again, thank you, Randy.
And Rob, don't you think we're looking forward to going to the red carpet for the opening of?
Well, I'm thinking if there's a screening party, I hope
there's
we get an invitation. Not,
I'll tell you,
we're fishing or anything, but
we're going to see. Most of our movies are being made in Canada these days.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Yeah, that'd be fun. Great. Well, thank you so much, Randy, and we wish you all the best, and hopefully we can chat again in the near future.
All right, thanks, guys.
Dr. Randy Woodley, back on the Vickers Crossing podcast, and again, the book is called Mission and the Cultural Other: A Closer Look. But look for other works of Randy's. Commend them all to you. And I know you're going to really have your lens changed a little bit by reading his stuff, and certainly has to me. Thank you to our sponsors today too. We want to thank A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Thank you to the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And that wraps up the latest episode of the Vickers Crossing, Kevin. So until we get together again, I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
And I'm Kevin George from St. Aidan's Anglican Church.
And remember, I got to remind you once in a while to always look both ways
before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!